The team was led by epidemiologists Les Roberts and Gilbert Burnham, and they decided to do a similar study, the same design that they had used in the Congo. And that is basically what's known as cluster sampling. They go and they find a random starting point, a home, and then they have a cluster of 40 or 30 homes within that area, and they knock on every single door. And then they say, have you had someone living in this home who's been killed during the war? Then they extrapolate out from that to the entire population. They compare it to a baseline of mortality before the war started. And what they come up with is a number of excess deaths due to the war. So this is not just direct deaths due to gunshot wounds or falling bombs. This is also, there was a lot of disease after the invasion. There was a lot of problems getting social services together. There was problems with food delivery. People starved to death. All of these things were included in these statistics. And it was a pretty small study. It found that they estimated that 100,000 people had died in the first 19 months of the war through 2004. And they got some criticism because it was a small sample. So they went back in 2006. The Center for International Studies it was the Center for International Studies at MIT commissioned the Johns Hopkins team to go back in 2006. And they did a bigger study, and let me just find the exact numbers. They visited 1,849 randomly selected households, and they asked again if somebody had died in that household. When they were told yes, they asked if they could see a death certificate. And in over 80% of the instances, they were shown a death certificate. So the headline number from that study, this is through July of 2006, was 650,000 deaths. This is what they estimated. But again, and I know that the best way to put a whole group of people to sleep in a late-night course is to talk statistics. But they can only really establish a range. So they said they could say with 95% degree of confidence that somewhere between 400,000 and 950,000 had died that would not have died before the invasion. So, this was... what followed was instructive. There was this huge controversy that ensued. Again, there had been no controversy when they'd done the same kinds of studies in previous conflicts. And the right-wing media at one point found out that George Soros had given MIT a small grant to do public education. And this was basically to print some materials and to send some of the studies investigators out to talk to people. Excuse me. So, of course, that was the George Soros derangement syndrome followed, and there was an enormous amount. They were basically pilloried in the conservative media, and they were accused of politicizing scientists, of science. The claim was made that they had timed the release of the study to coincide with the midterm elections in 2006. And basically what we had was this he said, she said in the corporate media. This was a story that was reported to some degree. It was reported when George Bush dismissed it out of hand, and it was reported when Tony Blair dismissed it out of hand. So what followed was this kind of he said, she said. On the one hand, you had the entire epidemiological community, and they were saying that this was the gold standard in methodology. And there were, of course, scientific quibbles. Anytime scientists get together, you get a bunch of arguments. But it wasn't those arguments that were the source of the stories. It was basically people who had no qualifications to say anything about it and who weren't really debating the validity of the studies against all of these very heavy-hitting scientists from Johns Hopkins. Now, the numbers were much higher than other estimates because it was an active attempt to ascertain the actual death toll. The other numbers that we've had were through passive means. Either there's the Iraq Body Count, which is a project that collects data on the number of people who are killed through violent means that are reported in the English language newspapers. Now, for obvious reasons, that's a fraction of the total. And there's studies that show that in the exception of Bosnia, there's no conflict situation where passive surveillance recorded more than 20% of the deaths measured by more direct population-based measures. So you expect to have those kinds of numbers be extremely lowball. And if the reporters had actually done their homework, there are a number of studies which show this. For example, in Guatemala, between 1960 and 1990, there was over 50% of deaths were reported in the media. Violent deaths were reported in the media during peacetime, and during flare-ups of that ongoing civil war, that was averaged at 5%. So you had this very small reporting level. The attack on the study's credibility was led by Neil Monroe. He was a big war supporter in the National Journal. It's kind of like an insidery DC rag. And it was picked up by the Wall Street Journal, which ran a big editorial. They called it the Soros Iraq death story. They said it was a sham. The New York Post, all the Murdoch papers really went after it in a big way. And, the bottom line is that there was a number of pieces of corroborating data, at least to corroborate the general scope of this of these claims, these findings. There are an estimated 4.5 million Iraqis who have been forced to flee either out of the country or remaining internally displaced. And we know from other wars, from other conflict situations, the general ratio would suggest at least hundreds of thousands dead when you have 4.5 million moving. The Iraqi ambassador to the U.S. said that there were 500,000 new widows created since the beginning of the war. So one assumes that they were married to someone who died. And an ABC USA Today poll of Iraqis in 2007 showed that 53% of Iraqis said that they had personally been physically harmed by the combat. Excuse me again.